On July 2nd, 1980, Baltimore Mayor Donald Schaefer presided over the grand opening of Harbor Place, a large shopping center replacing a decaying industrial port.
The opening of Harbor Place, the culmination of more than 2 years of controversy, planning, and a lot of hard work.
Situated in Baltimore's historic harbor just by downtown, it was joined by the National Aquarium in 1981, Oriola Stadium in 1992, and the newly enlarged Baltimore Convention Center in 1997 to form the core of a major downtown revitalization plan. Designed to inject life into a city which had seen its population drop by nearly 200,000 between 1950 and 1980, the Harbor Place model of post-industrial redevelopment was soon replicated across America, as cities from Boston to Seattle built monumental sports, convention, and tourism complexes, signaling the start of the so-called American urban renaissance. Yet, these transformations were often illusions, painting a veneer of prosperity over post-industrial realities of economic decline, racial segregation, wealth inequality, and police brutality in American cities. Today, we will examine why that is and how it came to be. Our story begins in 1938, when Hitler's Anschluss of Austria triggered a wave of Jewish immigration from the country, among them one Victor Grunbaum. Trained as an architect at the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, Grunbaum, Americanized as Gruen upon his arrival in New York, found considerable success planning shop interiors, and by 1951 had set up his own architectural firm. As described in a 2004 paper, Gruen observed the period of suburbanization in the US with concern, and believed that, quote, the post-war reconceptualization of cities, the reorganization of communities, and the need for suburban planning were a cluster of demands that could be addressed by a single commercial solution, unquote. As early as 1943, Gruen had drawn up plans for a combination office block, community center, and commercial space that would contain a post office, library, auditorium, offices, restaurants, and shops, a satellite downtown for rapidly growing suburbs far away from the city center. In 1952, Gruen was brought on by a developer in Edina, a suburb of Minneapolis, to make this dream a reality, and 2 years later, the Southdale Center, America's first shopping mall, was open for business. The concept was a huge success, and by 1990, over 36,000 such shopping centers had been built in the US, with over half of all American retail spending, excluding car purchases, occurring within them, according to a 1993 paper. At the same time that American suburbs and their shopping malls were taking off, American cities were rocked by two simultaneous trends. Between 1980 and 2010, the US lost more than 40%, or over 8 million manufacturing jobs, many of which had been concentrated in cities, especially in the Midwest, South, and East Coast. This was made worse by white flight. Across these same regions, white middle-class Americans increasingly left the cities for the suburbs to separate themselves from growing minority populations, taking their wealth with them. This problem was actually recognized at that time, even by conservatives. In 1969, at his confirmation hearing as Secretary for Housing and Urban Development, George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, complained that American urban policy had, quote, built a high-income white news basically around these inner cities, and the poor and disadvantaged, both black and white, are pretty much left in the inner city, unquote. By the late 70s, cities were facing a double crisis. The collapse of manufacturing had decimated their economic base, while the rapid outflow of the middle class endangered their fiscal position. This crisis came to a head in 1975, when New York City was nearly forced to declare bankruptcy. If American cities were to survive, they had to figure out how to shift from a production economy centered on manufacturing to a consumption economy fueled by domestic consumer spending. The neoliberal age had arrived. Cities quickly realized that to survive in the new post-industrial economy, they had to go where the money was, namely the suburban middle class. Navy Pier in Chicago, Pier 39 in San Francisco, and Harbor Place in Baltimore were redeveloped as entertainment complexes targeted at suburban day trippers. Sports complexes built in this period were also targeted at visiting outsiders, as attested by their massive parking lots and proximity to highways. The festival marketplace format, a European-style shopping market, was an especially popular design, appearing in cities including St. Paul, Miami, Buffalo, Oakland, New Orleans, Jacksonville, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Atlanta, Minneapolis, Dallas, St. Louis, and many others. These projects were nearly always marketed toward suburbanites visiting town rather than local residents. In his book Spaces for Consumption, Stephen Miles of the University of Brighton highlights that the redevelopment of Boston's Faneuil Hall into a public market was advertised with the slogan, "Cities are fun," hardly something you would say to the city's existing residents. More broadly, this period was the dawn of urban branding. New York City's world-famous I Heart NY logo was adopted in 1977, as the city struggled to reinvent itself as a tourist destination. However, simply building tourist traps wouldn't be enough to draw the middle classes, and their money, back into the city. Something else was needed, and this is where we return to the suburban shopping mall. Malls are much more than mere shopping centers. As described by a range of scholars, they also serve a major ideological purpose. Social inequality is hard to ignore in cities, where the homeless sit beneath glass towers and de facto racial segregation is immediately apparent. As American society struggled with these stark inequalities, culminating in widespread race riots in the late 60s, white middle-class Americans increasingly opted to instead withdraw to homogeneous suburbs where neither race nor class disparity was apparent, and where the liberal dream of America as a land of equal opportunity could be imagined as reality. As the American economy increasingly shifted towards greater consumption, suburban shopping malls were all too happy to accommodate this illusion. In his seminal work on the form and function of shopping malls, Dr. John Goss of the University of Hawaii claims that malls provide a, quote, strongly bounded or purified social space that excludes a significant minority of the population and so protects patrons from the moral confusion that a confrontation with social difference might provoke. Suburban malls in particular are essentially spaces for white middle classes, unquote. Mall security keeps out the homeless, as well as charities, because, quote, they remind the consumer of the existence of less privileged populations and so diminish the joy of shopping, unquote. In Spaces for Consumption, Miles further notes that political activities, like distributing pamphlets and staging protests, are typically forbidden in malls, creating the illusion of a public space but without political conflict or social tension. The mall, like the homogeneous suburb around it, pretends to be, quote, the ideal community where poverty is absent and where social divisions or eccentricities are erased, unquote. Or to put it another way, quote, the mall embodies the utopian desire for a purified community of social harmony, abundance, and classlessness, unquote. Let's look at one example of how cities attempted to recreate this same utopian image. The golden age of suburbs and shopping malls coincided with another major social trend, a growing fear of crime, especially urban crime. Crime rates did indeed rise in the 80s, but by the early 90s were in decline, reaching historic lows by the 2000s. But the public wasn't convinced. According to Gallup, in nearly every year since the question was first asked in 1989, a majority of Americans believe that crime is going up, an illusion of crime, especially urban crime, and something I discuss in more detail in my SUV video. At the same time, a new theory of crime management called broken windows policing began to take hold across American cities in the 90s. Based on a 1982 article and popularized by its adoption in New York in the early 90s, the theory held that most urban crime was ultimately rooted in minor public disorder, like graffiti, small-scale vandalism, and, of course, broken windows. The authors argued that these minor symbols of disorder provided signals to would-be criminals that the law was not being enforced, which then emboldened them to do more serious crime. To address crime, then, police should focus on teenage vandals, low-level drug dealers, and other minor transgressors, while cities should prioritize removing physical signs of quote-unquote disorder, like graffiti and derelict buildings. But it soon became clear that broken windows policing didn't actually work. The authors admitted that the argument was speculative and not based on actual evidence. And as conclusively demonstrated in a 2001 book by Dr. Bernard Harcourt of Columbia University, crime declined equally in cities that did and did not adopt the broken windows policing model. It turns out that the presence of unsupervised teens, public drunks, and graffiti artists doesn't actually cause major crime problems to develop.
The only thing that you see here is poverty, and that in itself is not a crime.
They are, however, unsettling in the eyes of cautious suburbanites who across the 90s were beginning to visit, work, shop, and increasingly live in the cities their parents had abandoned a generation before. As the title of Dr. Harcourt's book suggests, broken windows policing acted to create an illusion of order to counter the widespread illusion of urban crime and disorder. In 1993, Goss had argued that, above all, a visible security presence in the form of cameras and guards is essential to the shopping mall because it, quote, reassures preferred customers that the unseemly and seamy side of the real public world will be excluded from the mall, unquote. Even if this security was more theater than reality, as, quote, the image of security is more important than its substance, unquote. If cities were to compete for suburban consumer dollars, they needed to project the same illusion of middle-class security. Across the 90s and 2000s, misdemeanor arrests in New York City soared as the city prioritized arresting panhandlers and other individuals unsettling to middle-class eyes, even as only a third of felonies were cleared in the city. New York may look more orderly, but only because resources are diverted away from investigating more serious crimes. It's worth pausing here to note that post-industrial cities were pursuing suburban dollars out of a severe and justified sense of desperation. Between 1950 and 2018, cities like Buffalo and Cleveland lost over half of their populations, while St. Louis, Detroit, and Pittsburgh lost nearly 2/3. Crucially, most of these people stayed in the region. For example, across this period, the population of the entire Cleveland metropolitan area actually increased. Starting in the 80s, income inequality began to explode as well, as wealth was increasingly concentrated in the top 20% of the population, even as cities themselves were increasingly packed with poverty. According to a recent Rand Corporation study, between 1975 and 2018, the median worker's income increased just 8%, while that for the top 10% nearly doubled, and that for the top 1% increased by nearly 400%. At the same time, the racial wealth gap has persisted. The net worth of a typical white family today is currently nearly 10 times greater than of the average black family. In fact, according to the Brookings Institute, this gap has actually increased between 2000 and today. As a result, late 20th century cities increasingly lacked the fiscal base needed to keep things running. In the face of an economy which increasingly concentrated wealth in a small, professional, managerial, and suburban population, there simply was no alternative but to appeal to that population at the expense of all others. As Miles puts it, quote, "The idealized consumer which a city purports to attract is very different to the consumer of limited resources who accounts for a large proportion of the city's quote-unquote indigenous inhabitants," unquote. Some mayors have even enthusiastically embraced this approach. As mayor of New York City, Michael Bloomberg once said that it would be a godsend if he could get more billionaires to move to the city. Under the new neoliberal order, cities had no choice but to design themselves not for their citizens at large, but for a relatively wealthy minority. According to Miles, this model of development, quote, "articulates the interests and tastes of the postmodern professional and managerial class without solving the problems of a diminishing production base, growing disparities of wealth and opportunity, and the multiple forms of social exclusion," unquote. As that professional and managerial class controls more and more of America's wealth and income, American businesses and the cities that house them must increasingly appeal to their tastes and preferences to stay afloat financially. Expensive cafes and boutique stores, and the distinct architecture all associated with what's commonly called gentrification, are merely the aesthetic face on the growing economic dominance of the top 10 or 20% of the population, which everyone from ordinary workers to business owners and developers to entire cities must appeal to in order to financially survive. Some cities have been able to pivot to this new consumer model of the urban economy. Boston's redeveloped Faneuil Hall is a prime example. Transformed into a festival marketplace in the 1970s, by 2014 it had more visitors than Disney World or the Eiffel Tower. But this came at a cost. Miles describes the Faneuil redevelopment as, quote, "a scene untroubled by all the competing and troubling realities of the industrial past or the post-industrial present. Here was a carefully managed enclave from which all the many problems of urban decay, crime, social and racial tension had been banished," unquote. Increasingly, the job of urban governance, as described by Dr. David Harvey of CUNY, is not to improve the lives of the city's residents, but, quote, "to lure highly mobile and flexible production, financial, and consumption flows into its space," unquote. That is, to promote its brand to suburbanites, tourists, and potential investors. According to Miles, this form of urban management, quote, "encourages the promotion of order at the expense of lived social relations, and the ability to look past distress, destruction, and marginalization to see only the good life, for some," unquote. Just as their shopping mall equivalents, even ostensibly left-wing cities crack down so harshly on homelessness that courts have sometimes been forced to step in. Allegedly left-wing mayors have been hesitant to confront abusive law enforcement, perhaps because they understand that the police are central to maintaining that illusion of order which keeps the middle-class dollars flowing. Cities are also willing to commit to increasingly drastic measures to secure their commercial centers from any sign of disorder. When the George Floyd protests in Chicago threatened to escalate, Mayor Lori Lightfoot took the unprecedented step of raising the bridges which surround downtown, creating a literal moat separating the Michigan Avenue shopping district from the poor south of the city. A recent interview with the mayor of Portland is perhaps the strongest evidence. When asked about the consequences of the George Floyd protests, he stated that, quote, "I think the more important question is protecting and expanding the brand of the city. That's probably the mayor's primary duty," unquote. But many cities did not make it, and America's post-industrial heartland is littered with the corpses of failed tourist-driving projects. In 2019, with many of its storefronts vacant, Baltimore's Harbor Place underwent financial default. Even as malls began to die a slow death in the 2010s, the mallification of America has accelerated. Malls themselves may be dying off, but their design, marketing, and security strategies, all oriented towards increasing sales to customers, had been fully adopted by American cities. Cities increasingly prop up a mirage of economic success and depoliticized order, typically in a tightly monitored core like Detroit's Woodward Avenue, even as poverty and police brutality plague huge numbers of their residents. As Miles reminds us, for the modern city, quote, "the image of prosperity must win out, regardless of the less palatable truths that may lay underneath," unquote. Victor Gruen returned to Vienna in 1968, apparently disgusted by what the shopping mall had become in the US. Gruen had been a member of the Socialist Party before the war, and his real passion was building lively urban spaces. He designed the pedestrian mall in downtown Kalamazoo in Michigan, and upon returning to Austria, planned Vienna's Kartnerstrasse, a hugely popular pedestrianized shopping street. He had envisioned malls as a center of community and social solidarity in otherwise alienating suburbs, and denounced American shopping malls as, quote, "functional ghettos," unquote, run by, quote, "fast buck promoters and speculators," unquote. Yet in hindsight, perhaps this was unavoidable. Unwilling to confront its problems of wealth and racial inequality, it was inevitable that America would first fall in love with the shopping mall, and then, in the post-industrial age, attempt to turn its cities into giant shopping malls tailored exclusively to the desires of the largely white and suburban middle class. As long as income inequality keeps rising, cities must do everything they can to appeal to the richest at the expense of everybody else, not out of greed, but out of economic necessity. Former industrial sites will increasingly be replaced by futuristic developments targeted at those with the most money, like London's Canary Wharf, New York's Hudson Yards, or Chicago's Lincoln Yards, while poor communities will see continued disinvestment and depopulation. The built environment around us reflects the inequalities of class and race that dominate our society. Unless we can address them, our cities will continue transforming into little more than enormous shopping malls.